Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a State of the Class video about Blood Death Knights. I've been playing Blood DK since Kata. I mean, technically speaking, I've played it since Wrath of the Lich King beta. I played it more as a DPS spec and mostly tanked as Frost, but that was early on in Wrath when you could technically play all three specs as a DPS or a tank, and long before the community had solved the problem of which specs perform which role best. What a time to be dead. Blood DKs are the most effective litmus test for the quality of tanks across the entire game at a given time. They're the best yardstick, the best some other metaphor for taking the temperature of all the tanks at once. Essentially, it goes like this. Most of the time, when Blood DKs are good, tanking is good. Tanks are happy. When Blood DKs are bad, tanking is bad. Tanks aren't happy. And I am happy to report that right now, Blood DK is very good, and tanking in general is very good. So that is the thesis statement for this video. Blood is good. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Let's start by diving a little deeper with some probing questions. What's good about Blood DK? What's bad about it? Why isn't everyone at the high end playing it? Why is it consistently popular? And in the Pally video, when you said Pally's the tank you should play if you want to just play one tank and be great at everything, did you actually mean Blood DK? Let's start with that last one first. In a lot of ways, I do think that Blood DKs are a mirror image of Protection Paladins, both in terms of how they play and how they are constructed right now, but also in terms of their ups and downs in popularity throughout the history of the game. I think they're like reflections of each other in the parts of the game in which they excel. Pallies really are that all-purpose, always good option in Mythic Plus that consistently brings a unique power that makes them great. They have interrupts, they have immunities, we already covered all that. Blood DKs are basically that, but for raids. And that segues into those other questions, I think, pretty nicely. This is what's good about Blood DK. It has insane self-healing. No other tank is even remotely close to Blood DK when it comes to being defensively self-sufficient in raids. Death Strike is extremely strong. But there's more to it than that. They have powerful defensive cooldowns, and a lot of them. They have unique defensive utility in Anti-Magic Shell, they have unique group utility from Death Grip, and they can reliably immune pushback and knockback effects thanks to Death's Advance, which is extremely powerful for a lot of raid fights. The bad part of Blood DK is that their damage output isn't great. Even if you play Blood DK well, you are leaving tens of thousands of DPS on the table compared to playing a Monk or a Bear Druid, and the defensive gap between those tanks isn't all that large. Also, I'm kind of going off script here a bit, but another real downside to Blood DK is that they have to actually be in melee range of the enemy to be able to heal themselves, and this means that they are very susceptible to a lot of raid mechanics that force you out of melee range. If you're not able to stay in melee range and Death Strike, you're basically just like a big bag of meat that needs to be bombed with heals to be kept alive. In general, I think DK damage isn't as big of a problem as it was early on in the expansion, but it's still on the lower end of the spectrum. There are a couple of other issues here as well. DK doesn't contribute to Blizzard's evil debuff matrix, and in the spots where Death Grip is useless, their utility is very limited. This is the number one reason why every top guild doesn't run a Blood DK all the time in Prague. It's really not the damage. The defensive consistency is great, the damage difference is a minor inconvenience by comparison, but the utility that you get from a Monk or a Paladin is way harder to replace than the utility you get from a Blood DK. You can just use DPS DKs. They have Death Grip, they have Abomination Limb 2, that works fine. The added damage you get from a Monk is a small bonus. The real difference maker is the stupid Monk debuff. So that being said, the consistent defensive value and the ability to have Death Grip available when you need it is why Blood DK remains consistently popular and why it will always be popular no matter what is going on with the class. It's why I always try to keep my Blood DK at a competitive item level during farm, even if I have no plan of playing it in Prague. I just want to be prepared in case it's needed. It's so much better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So now let's talk about history a bit. Since Cataclysm, Blood Death Knight has been the leader among tanks in active mitigation. Death Strike and the rest of the Blood DK toolkit were what created active mitigation as a concept. It's probably better phrased as reactive mitigation, Prior to the advent of Blood DKs, the tank's job was to manage threat, position mobs, and occasionally use their one defensive skill. If you needed more damage reduction than that, you would use a defensive cooldown. If you needed healing, that usually had to come from the healer. Blood DK was a revolution in tanking. Not only did they have self-healing, they had it available very often. It wasn't lay on hands or some huge multi-minute cooldown, it was a rotational skill. Ironically, once upon a time, Blood DKs also dealt tons of damage compared to their competition. It's very weird to think back on how much I love Blood DK and Kata because its damage was huge. Very funny to think about, just really how the world has changed. Over the years, this rating has become far, far more optimized than it was back in the ancient days of Cataclysm, and more than Blizzard could have ever imagined. The ability for tanks to maintain their health pools has become not a nice added bonus, but a necessity to remain competitive. Other tanks have received self-heals like Word of Glory, proactive mitigation tools like Ignore Pain and Celestial Brew, and so many defensive cooldowns. But can they keep up with Blood DK in terms of healing? Hell no. They never have and they never will. This particular advantage has caused players in high-level rating circles to consider Blood DK the default tank. This has arguably been true since all the way back in Cataclysm, but it was really codified into tanking law in the years since Legion. If you had to go into a new fight sight unseen, no testing, no dungeon journal, no clue what's going on at all, Blood DK would probably be the most popular tank in the top level guilds. Oh man, completely blind prog and wow, what a concept. Blood DK is the gold standard for tanking in raids. It's not necessarily what everyone plays all the time. It's not necessarily always the best. Tank balance shifts back and forth and the debuff matrix demands its pound of flesh, but it's basically an accepted rule that as a high-level tank, you have to know how to play Blood DK. And you should try to keep a Blood DK competitively geared at all times. As for whether you actually like playing Blood DK or not, I would say that is not important. But that being said, I am happy to say that the current version of Blood is my favorite iteration of the class in a really long time. I think it's really fun to play in addition to being strong, and that's great. And on that note, let's jump forward to Shadowlands and Dragonflight Blood DK. Shadowlands gave Blood DK some really excellent fun Covenant powers like Abomination Limb, but it also perpetuated a lot of the aspects of the class design that had sucked over the previous decade, the worst of which is resource starvation. To fix that, you would just stack an insane amount of haste, as much haste as you possibly could get. Haste all the way to the moon, and then the class feels good again. Dragonflight has solved this issue by just giving Blood DKs a lot more baseline resource generation. Haste is still a good stat, but you no longer feel this overwhelming need to talent into and optimize for resource generation at every possible turn. And here's an example. Blood Tap, which is a very good resource generation talent, has an incredibly low usage rate, like less than 1%. Despite really not being that far out of the way in the tree, just because it's not required anymore, it does take a couple points to get. Not worth going to get, don't need the resources that badly. To put it simply, this has made playing Blood DK suck a lot less than it used to. Other quality of life additions like Death's Echo granting 2 charges of Death's Advance, Death and Decay, and Death Grip have really just made Blood DK feel a lot less annoying to play, which it was kind of annoying to play in Shadowlands and before. And in fact, I think I maybe have even buried the lead here. The most annoying aspect of Shadowlands Blood DK was the Season 3 and Season 4 tier set bonus, which mandated that you spam cast Heartstrike to maintain near permanent uptime on Dancing Rune Weapon and a massive strength buff. This was great in terms of damage and defense, but good God did it suck to play. It made Blood DK the most popular tank in the game by a mile, but it was the least fun to play by a light year. Thankfully, that annoying stuff is all gone. The positive aspects of Shadowlands Dancing Rune Weapon bonuses are still there. Casting it grants Bone Shield, consuming Bone Shields grants cooldown reduction. It's a strong defensive cooldown that helps with damage and threat. It's a good skill, part of a toolkit, but not the all-important bonus that you build your entire rotation and playstyle around maintaining at the risk of dying if you screw up. It's a lot better now. So now let's talk about the way that Blood DK survives. You maintain Bone Shield to mitigate physical damage, you generate Runic Power with Heartstrike, and you spend Runic Power on Deathstrike to stay alive. It's that simple. You have reliable damage mitigation, steady self-healing, and a big bag of defensive cooldowns. Other tanks like Monk and Paladin optimize more around mitigating big predictable spikes of damage, and I think generally speaking that is kind of a better, more efficient approach to surviving a lot of the modern tank encounters in WoW. They're built to be mostly big, boring auto attack fests, punctuated by huge bursts of damage. Monk is built perfectly for that, but Aberrus was different. Aberrus was just a parade of bosses that auto attack and put spell damage over time onto the tank with each swing. Amirdrasil seems like it's going to have several fights that could have been straight out of that Aberrus hellscape playbook. This isn't so much a strength for Blood DK as it is a weakness for every tank except Blood DK and Prot Pally. I guess that's basically the same as a strength. Death Strike is damage agnostic. It heals you based on how much damage you've taken recently, and that's all that matters. It doesn't care what type of damage you took, spell damage, auto attacks, damage over time, boss hit, doesn't matter. You press the button, you get a big heal either way. Because of this, Blood DK is way more resilient against sustained damage over time than every tank other than Paladin, because Pallies for some reason get multiple layers of damage reduction against damage over time. Consider that a big point in favor of Blood. Blood DK does have a similar version of the main downside of Paladin. You always want to fight inside your Death and Decay pool, but unlike Pallies, you're not relying on that Death and Decay to fuel your damage reduction or your defenses. It grants you more cleave on your Heart Strike, which is good for damage. It grants you more damage, healing, and haste, but it's only about 5 to 6% of each of those three stats. Unlike Pallies and Consecration, Death and Decay is a lot more forgiving. You can cast Death and Decay anywhere within 30 yards, so you can set it out to tag packs of enemies from range, or place it in the direction of a spot you're running toward with the intention of stopping once you get there. On a more important note, you're just not tuned around having to stand in a stupid pool all the time. It's a handful of useful but non-essential added bonuses for being in Death and Decay. It is not a mandatory defensive layer that demands you submit to it in order for the class to function. Okay, now let's talk about rotational friction. This is something I've brought up in the Monk and Paladin videos because it's very relevant to playing both of those classes. I'm going to redefine it here just for the sake of clarity and whatever. Rotational friction is when you have two or more skills that you want to use at the same time, but they're all on the global cooldown, so you can only use one at once. You have to make a choice between them. For years, this was not really a huge issue. You had skills, you used them in a certain priority, everything was fine. Combat in WoW was fluid and it felt good. Then Battle for Azeroth came along, and Blizzard decided they had to do something drastic. They had to ruin WoW. They put everything on the global cooldown. I mean everything. Ignore pain. Charge. Nearly every offensive or defensive or mobility skill or cooldown that you could think of. In the years since the absolutely horrendous mistakes of patch 8.0, Blizzard has steadily walked back most of these massive mistakes. The game is nearly all the way back to where it was before they decided to ruin it. Again, I don't know why they did in the first place. Why is demoralizing shout still in the global cooldown? Who knows? They never gave a good explanation. At this point, I think it was just a prank. But there was one tank that came through that mess with almost no issues. Blood DK. Blood DK's main self-heal is also a damage dealing skill. It didn't really have many offensive or defensive cooldowns to put on the global cooldown, and most of its power comes from its rotational skills, which are all attacks of some kind. So, just to make a comparison, let's look at Monk and Paladin again. Monk has a bunch of really strong offensive skills available all the time, and you have to choose between them in a specific order in order to optimize your damage output. As for Paladin, you don't have as much friction in the base rotation, but the need to recast Consecration every single time you're forced to move is rotationally disruptive, and your main self-heal is on the global cooldown, so you have to stop doing everything else anytime you want to heal. That really is the main conflict there. In order for Paladin, Druid, or Monk to heal or shield themselves, they have to stop doing all the other stuff that reduces their damage taken. They have to stop generating resources in order to spend them. The most polite thing I can say about that is that it's a conflicted game design. If I'm being more honest, it's stupid. It's a bad design built on top of layers of worse decisions made long ago by designers who haven't worked on WoW in years. It should be burned to the ground, the earth should be salted, and their work should be forgotten. The good news here is that Blood DK doesn't have any of these annoying constraints. You spend runes to generate runic power, then you spend the runic power to heal. By the time that's all spent, your runes are recharged and you're ready to repeat the cycle. On the rotational front, everything flows into itself very cleanly. In terms of choosing between damage and defense, you deal damage and heal yourself with the same keybind. There is no frustrating choice to be made. The only lingering vestiges of the Battle for Azeroth global cooldown massacre are that Tombstone and Dancing Rune Weapon are still on the GCD. They're relatively strong cooldowns and they're both around 1 minute average cooldowns, so this makes them a minor inconvenience, not a rotation ruining problem. Okay, let's move on from the worst time in our past and go over some of the popularity stats for Blood DK. Blood DKs were one of the most popular tanks in Vault of the Incarnates. This was particularly true on Raszageth due to that fight's Phase 1 pushback. Having a Blood DK was essentially mandatory, and if you need a class for the final fight of a raid, you probably want to have it for the whole raid. So Blood DK was very popular in that entire raid. In Aberos, they've again been a very popular tank. They're the most popular overall in farm, and they were very near the top in progression, but not quite the number one. On Mythic Sarkareth, they're more of an upper middle of the pack choice, very good but not quite dominant. Now, I think the main reason for Blood DK's increase in popularity throughout farm is pretty simple. People are playing Blood DK in farm raid to make sure it's ready for the next tier, just in case it's needed. They're playing alts. In terms of Blood DK's popularity in Mythic Plus, it's pretty good. It's usually a pretty popular tank in Mythic Plus. The main issue Blood DK runs into is that eventually it just really struggles to live through the start of hard-hitting pulls, and once you get to high enough levels, every pull hits hard. That's pretty true in this season. It's been an above-average tank in Mythic Plus so far in Dragonflight, but once you get to the true upper echelon, the 25 to 30 plus range, it completely falls off a cliff, and that's okay. If we look back at Shadowlands a bit, we see it was insanely dominant by the end of the expansion, but it was way less popular early on in the expansion. It really wasn't doing that well at the start. And then finally, kind of going back to my previous BFA slander, well, again, not slander really, BFA hatred, jumping all the way back to the first season of BFA just to show off how bad that set of GCD changes was for everyone else. You can really see it reflected here. Blood DK was insanely dominant in Season 1 of BFA because it was the tank that was least ruined by the terrible GCD changes. Okay, I mentioned earlier that Blood DK damage is bad. I'm always saying this is kind of my thing. That being said, Blood has received tons and tons of damage buffs throughout the expansion, especially in the middle of Season 2. Again, Blood DK's damage isn't good, but it is competitive now. It's at the low end of the spectrum, but it's not a liability anymore, and I think it's really not an issue in Mythic Plus either. If I had to point to a single problem with the way Blood DK deals damage, it's not the numbers, it's the ability design. In Mythic Plus, when you have Abomination Limb or Dancing Rune Weapon available at the start of a pull, holding threat is trivial. Without either of those cooldowns, your AoE damage is spread into a lot of different abilities, and holding threat is a lot more challenging on a Blood DK than it is for most other tanks. Like, just to give a rundown, here's how you establish AoE threat on every other tank. Bear Druid hits Thrash, Paladin hits Avenger's Shield, Monk hits Keg Smash, Warrior hits Thunderclap and Revenge, Demon Hunter hits Sigil of Flame and Immolation Aura. For Blood DK, you cast Death and Decay from range, then Death Caress so you have Bone Shield charges before you get meleeed, then you cast Blood Boil once you're in melee range and use Heart Strike once you're into the Death and Decay. Maybe you have threat locked up by that point, but maybe you need Blood Boil again, then you Death Grip and Death Strike any stragglers, and okay! Now you've secured threat, and you are ready to tank. Holding threat in AoE as a Blood DK is a lot more involved than it is for any other tank. Maybe that's the price of being defensively self-sufficient. It's not a deal breaker, but I do see it as a fundamental weakness of the class. I also just don't see the justification for why Blood Boil's damage sucks. Why is Blood DK's AoE snap threat so much weaker than every other tank's? It's such a weird gap in an otherwise nearly perfect tanking toolkit. I've said it before about other things, but once again, no other tank is like this. Why? Okay, now let's move on to the future of the class. Here's an exhaustive list of changes Blizzard is planning for Blood DKs in patch 10.2. Honestly, this is fine. You can't improve on perfection. Despite me just saying that their damage is low, I think Blizzard has buffed Blood DK damage like 10 times this expansion. Do they really need an 11th? I don't know, maybe. Either way, let's move on to the tier set bonuses, which are a big improvement. Here's the two-piece. Consuming Runic Power has a chance to cause your next Heart Strike to apply Ashen Decay, reducing damage dealt to you by 10% and increasing your damage dealt to afflicted targets by 20% for 8 seconds. The 4-piece is Soul Reaper's execute damage and A-Bomb Limbs damage applies Ashen Decay to enemy targets, and Heart Strike and Blood Boil's direct damage extends Ashen Decay by 1 second. So let's once again throw out some numbers just to quantify how good these bonuses are. First off, testing on the 2-piece bonus by the community puts the proc rate around 1% per runic power, but it seems to be unaffected by the reduced runic power cost from Ossuary, so around a 40%-ish proc rate per Death Strike. In my testing, it was a little lower, more like 30 to 35% chance per Death Strike, but it could have been just unlucky. My sample size wasn't huge, a couple hundred Death Strikes, not anything definitive by any stretch. In ideal circumstances, you cast Death Strike about every 3.5 seconds. This means you're triggering that proc every 9 seconds. This means that hypothetically you could maintain 100% uptime when you include the 2-piece and 4-piece, and it shouldn't really even be that difficult if your proc rates are nice and clean and evenly spaced. And if you're never getting forced out of melee range by boss mechanics. That's all unrealistic, and because you have to trigger the proc with Death Strike and then cast Heart Strike to apply it, there is a bit of a disconnect. I think this generally means you're probably going to see some gaps in uptime, but I don't think it's that huge of a problem. Even assuming very conservatively that you're getting more like 75 to 80% uptime, this is still a 16% damage bonus on average, and 8% average damage reduction. That very easily clears my personal 5% floor on bonuses that do stuff. And again, I think the 80% uptime estimate is pretty conservative, maybe very conservative. You're probably more likely to be in the low to mid 90s once the 4-piece gets factored in, depending on how much movement you have to do for a given boss. In general, it's a really good bonus. I also like that it's not particularly disruptive. It mostly just rewards you for performing the rotation normally and correctly, and that's good. The Abomination Limb component is really good in AoE situations and in Mythic Plus as well. You get a large offensive and defensive bonus tacked onto a really good AoE damage cooldown, so that should help make your health pool a bit more stable early on in pulls. This is usually the most dangerous section of a pull in Mythic Plus for all tanks, but it's especially true for Blood DK. Now let's talk about some of the downsides to this bonus. First off, it has a weird 2-hit combo component to applying what is a pretty strong debuff. It's a good debuff, I like that, but I don't think the ramp up aspect of it is necessary. Blood DK already has to ramp up its damage by hitting tons of different skills, so adding even more setup and inconsistency into that ramp up is a strange choice. I think it takes the worst aspect of the class and doubles down on it. And also, I've only really been looking at this bonus from a raid perspective. It's applied by Heart Strike, not Blood Boil, so it is target capped. You have to be in Death and Decay in order to hit more than 2 targets with a Heart Strike at once, and even then the maximum you can hit with a single Heart Strike is 5. As you can see from my testing on these training dummies here, they're pretty spread out. I'm struggling to hit more than 1 at once, and hitting all 3 with a single Heart Strike is not possible. This tier set is very low on quality of life for Mythic Plus. I think it'll make Blood DK even better than it already is in raids, but I really don't think it's going to launch them up out of that middle of the pack range in Mythic Plus, especially given that Monk, Warrior, and Demon Hunter are all poised to make big leaps up in the next season of Mythic Plus. If this bonus could be applied by Blood Boil instead of Heart Strike, or in addition to Heart Strike, or if Blood Boiling a target affected by it would spread it, or just something that made this work in AoE, I think it could be really good in Mythic Plus. As it currently exists, kinda sucks. Good numerically, easy to use in raids and on tyrannical bosses, fine in small pulls, but very, very underwhelming and annoying in large AoE pulls. And finally, there's one other thing I haven't even mentioned yet, and that's Soul Reaper. The 4-piece bonus can trigger Ashen Decay whenever you use Soul Reaper, and it does its execute damage hit. Now, if we look at the current usage rate of Soul Reaper in raids, right now, farm raids, parse raids, People going for maximum damage, not worrying about defense. The usage rate is 0.0. No one uses it. It's a bad talent for doing damage, and that's all it does. The reason's pretty simple. It's a single target execute that deals a lot of damage, but it costs a rune. The same as Heart Strike. Unlike Heart Strike, which generates 15 runic power, Soul Reaper only generates 10. It also requires sacrificing either A-Bomb Limb or Empower Rune Weapon, both of which generate a ton of resources and generally add a lot more damage over the course of a fight than Soul Reaper can during the execute phase. So do I think this will actually cause Soul Reaper to get used? No. I could be wrong. Maybe haste values will reach the point in the new max item level that Empower Rune Weapon won't be necessary to maintain a smooth rotation. And maybe players who are looking to parse will be able to justify dropping Empower Rune Weapon in favor of Soul Reaper in single target raid fights. It's still worthless in Mythic Plus, it's still worthless in AoE, and I feel pretty confident saying that not only is it worthless in prog raiding, it is actively harmful to run Soul Reaper instead of Empower Rune Weapon in progression raiding. So is the Soul Reaper part of this bonus any good? Nope, I don't think so. I think it's completely dead on arrival. That's okay, the A-Bomb Limb component of it's really good. All the rest of the bonus is really good. I think you just don't even worry about the fact that it has any interaction with Soul Reaper. Maybe that'll change deep into farm. Maybe it'll be good, but I seriously doubt it. All right, let's wrap things up here. Blood DK is, as usual, very strong in raids. It's one of the best raid tanks in the game, tier in, tier out. I see absolutely no reason why that would change when their new tier set bonus is going to make them even stronger in raids than they already were. In Mythic Plus, it's been above average in Dragonflight. Dragonflight's been a good expansion for Blood DK, but they haven't been dominant Mythic Plus tanks at any point. I don't think that's going to change either. Unlike the slight increase in power that Blood is receiving in raids, I think they're going to take a small dip in Mythic Plus power. The quality of life of the new tier set bonuses, it's just, they're really, really low quality. The underlying class is still very strong, so I don't think they're falling off a cliff here by any stretch, and I think it's important to consider how raid popularity affects Mythic Plus popularity, especially at the beginning of the season. Blood will still be popular in Mythic Plus. Even if it was straight trash in Mythic Plus, it would be popular because it's good in raids, and people playing the class in raids are going to run Mythic Plus to get more gear for raiding. But also it is good in Mythic Plus. It has some concerns, but that's mainly just the issue of snap threat. Playing Blood DK in Mythic Plus is still a very positive experience on the whole. Like, I kind of let this slide under the radar, but I just wanted to say it at some point in the video. The ability to grip caster mobs and archers into melee range in Mythic Plus is immensely satisfying. It's really hard to switch to another tank after you've been playing Blood DK for a while. Giving up Death Grip after you've gotten used to it is a painful adjustment. Everyone knows how strong it is, but even so, it feels undervalued. All that being said, Blood DK has really stiff competition in Mythic Plus, and the new tier set leaves a lot to be desired there. The positive is that the underlying class is strong. I still think DK is going to be fine until you get into that true upper echelon of elite key pushing. So here we are, conclusion time. Blood DK is great. It's more fun to play right now than it has been in a long time, maybe ever. It's amazing in raids, it's good in Mythic Plus, and much like Paladin, it's a great choice if you just want to play one tank. It's basically the other side of that coin. It has almost no defensive group utility at all, but that does mean less keybinding. You don't have as many abilities to keybind and keep track of. Kind of easier on that front. Technically you have anti-magic zone, but that's it for group utility. It's all just personal defensive utility, mob control with Death Grip, but Death Grips are completely irreplaceable. They make every situation with ranged adds so much easier to deal with. Add all of that onto an unparalleled amount of control over your health pool, and you've got a tank that's great in every situation. You can never go wrong by playing Blood DK. And I gotta say, working on this video kind of rekindled my love for the class. It's pretty dope. All right, that is it. Thanks for watching. Bye.